What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Decred in Depth. I'm your host, Angelo, and on today's show, we have Mr. Dave Collins, DCRD, lead dev. Dave, how you doing?
Doing great. How about yourself?
Excellent. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about your background and your intro into the CC space for those that don't know.
So my background, I've been programming for quite a long time. I've done everything from low-level assembler on embedded systems, custom proprietary systems, all the way up through the web stack, HTML, JavaScript, all the things that you typically see in your browser. As far as my intro into the cryptocurrency space, I was working for, at the time, it was Conformal Systems, but we've become Company Zero now. And we were working on a separate product at the time that had to do with crypto as well. And we kind of got interested in Bitcoin around that time. I'm going to say that was probably about 2013, perhaps, somewhere around in there. And that was the basic introduction to it.
So we all know that C0 was responsible for building BTC Suite. How did you and Jake meet, and how was that development team assembled?
So at the time, when we all met, a lot of folks were contributing to OpenBSD, which is one of the most secure operating systems in the world. And some of us also worked in the physical world in some large corporations. A couple of the folks that kind of knew each other ended up meeting with Jake with the intention of building at the time, as a remote storage product, a secure, cryptographically secured remote storage product where only you had the keys. The service didn't have the keys, which is a big difference between a lot of the existing storage products. So originally the team was put together to work on that product. Around the same time was about the time we started getting interested in Bitcoin, and we decided to shift focus towards Bitcoin because that was also about the time that most of the bigger players like Google were getting involved in giving away free storage in exchange for your privacy. And as it turned out, most people don't mind giving up their privacy for free storage. And so it's kind of hard to compete with free. So we ended up shifting focus towards wanting to build basically products or services on top of Bitcoin. And one of the things we noticed is that we were looking at the existing, at the time it was Bitcoin D, it's now Bitcoin Core. The code back then was really quite poor. It was completely all in one file. There was no, most of the time whenever you're trying to build services on top of any kind of a product, you have libraries or other components that you can interact with in order to build your services on top. But there wasn't any of that. And so also the software, Bitcoin D at the time, wouldn't build on OpenBSD, which, as I mentioned, we were all pretty heavily involved in OpenBSD in one way or another. And so, we decided that that it would actually, part of that was that we were going to have to build a lot of the components ourselves to be able to build the service that we wanted to, but also that we saw that there was only that single implementation on the entire network. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we firmly believe that having a single implementation is actually a vulnerability or a weak point at the very least in the system, since it creates a monoculture. So we decided that once we had already started going down that path of building the components in order to build the service on top of it, that we were just going to go ahead and take the plunge and create an entire alternative full node implementation, fully validating node.
So now when that second version was created, I guess if you want to go over some of the details, maybe some of the troubles that you faced with the core team when it was built out and presented.
So we originally, we had started to kind of put it out in pieces as we built each component because as I had mentioned, the existing code at the time, or the C++ code, the Bitcoin D client at the time, it was all monolithic, everything. There was no components that you could build on. So we decided that we were going to make sure that we built it, that it all had components that built the core software itself, so that the ultimate full node was actually using all these components. And then people that wanted to build services could also consume those exact same components with full confidence that they were actually running a full node as well. So they were, properly developed, tested, and basically well optimized, or reasonably well optimized. So we had started to basically release those components, and we really didn't hear much at the time. A lot of people were like, hey, thanks, this is good, this is high quality, there's documentation, I can follow it, and and things were going fairly well in terms of the acceptance and adoption. A lot of people were quite excited by it. Once we got everything done and we had the full node out, it kind of changed. Most of the core developers at the time were not at all happy about the fact that there was a separate implementation, full node implementation, and they started warning everybody that you shouldn't run it, that it's a danger to the network to have multiple implementations because one might not agree and you might fork off. And I think in a certain respect, there is some truth in that for sure. I mean, obviously, whenever you have any kind of a new piece of software, it is fairly common for there to have bugs that need to be worked out. And you certainly want to, make sure that you're not completely relying on that. But as we came to, I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but I think later on, it actually had a lot more to do with the issues that it exposed with the current structure of Bitcoin, as opposed to anything specific with the software. Because by all accounts, everyone who looked at it agreed that it was high quality software, and it passed all of the existing unit tests and consensus tests. There was an entire tool that tested all the rules, and it passed everything. And it had been running for quite some time with no issues, no forks or anything. But it ended up more being about the governance aspects and the weaknesses that it exposed in the overall infrastructure of the system.
Dave, so what are some of the problems you see within the BTC project that Decred solves?
Right. So I think one of the primary issues is, of course, we talk about governance, but I think in more concrete terms, it has to do a lot about how decisions get made in terms of changing what really is one of the biggest things that helps give value to the network. And those are known as the consensus rules. Those are the rules that actually dictate exactly what is legal and what is not legal on the network. I think a lot of times, I'm sure many of the listeners have heard the idea that, the math, it's ruled by math. And in many ways that is correct, that you have all these rules. However, human governance is a bit messy in the sense that things change over time. You need to upgrade. New technology comes along that's better. Perhaps there are bugs that are found that need to be dealt with. There are all kinds of scenarios that arise where it is necessary to change some of those rules, those consensus rules. And once you start to get into the questions surrounding that, you really start to see the weaknesses in the Bitcoin system. So, what Decred basically has really tried to do is make it there's a very clear process and also a much fairer process in terms of who gets to decide who makes those changes. A lot of times, if we talk about the way that this happens in Bitcoin, it's not very clear at all, realistically. I mean, there's a couple of narratives out there that actually they go against each other. Sometimes people say it's the miners. Sometimes people say it's actually the nodes that decide. Other people say it's the developers. Other people say it's the economic nodes. So there's all these different components. But the thing is when you really start digging into it, you start to realize that there is no clear picture away. It's this whole idea of what's known as this rough consensus. And so, Decred actually, the primary aim of the governance system, and one of the primary reasons we originally created it, is specifically to solve that issue. In Decred, we know there's a very set, clear process. You know that the stakeholders are going, a consensus rule change is going to go up for a vote. And we can go more in depth on that. There's a whole process that it goes through, but the general idea is that these rules go up for a vote, and then stakeholders that have skin in the game, they actually have locked up their coins to purchase tickets, and then these tickets get called randomly, and then those they vote on whether or not that consensus rule is going to be accepted or not. And so by doing this, we completely remove the ambiguity and any chance of having, perhaps if you believe, just regardless of whichever version of the events you want to believe, you do have ultimately, without that type of system, there is a group of people who gets to decide what rules go into the software in Bitcoin. you can argue about who that group is, but in the end, somebody has to merge the code, somebody has to make the change. All these people that are involved have to agree. The node has to be downloaded and so on. So there definitely is a group of people. But I think that to me, I think that's one of the biggest or the most important things that Decred brought, as far as right out of the gate anyway, is the fact that the process for making those changes is very clear, very well defined, and very fair.
So now we've had this conversation off record. What is your definition of a fairness launch, and what are the issues with proof of work that most aren't seeing when it comes to that?
This is kind of an interesting question, because fair is often rather subjective when you really examine it. To me, a fair launch is one that is transparent and provides the opportunity for a wide distribution of the bulk of the total number of coins. One of the common narratives that I've seen in regards to this idea is that proof of work launches are inherently more fair than say pre-mines with airdrops. But so then that begs the question, fair for whom? Right? Is it fair for the poor farmer who's never even heard of the latest and greatest GPU that's needed to mine the most coins? Or if it's not GPU mined, is it fair if the people who launched it already have some purpose-built custom hardware unbeknownst to everyone else that allows them to have a huge advantage? Or is it fair that some people get free electricity to mine with while others have to pay exorbitant rates? Or is it even, in terms of pre-mines, is it more fair that Satoshi entity effectively pre-mined at least around 1 million Bitcoin by most reasonable estimates due to the circumstances at the time, versus an airdrop, which results in stronger decentralization out of the gate? So all these questions, when you start to look at them, it really becomes a question. It's like, okay, well, fair for whom? And so now I'm not saying that all pre-mines are necessarily fair either, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's important to examine systems individually and in context. And, that's why I say that transparency is really paramount and key, so that everyone involved, everyone who chooses to opt into the system, knows exactly what they're getting into and if that is acceptable to them or not.
That was the most important thing for me, was the transparency when I took a look at the Decred project and decided to get involved. Dave, you always speak about Decred's consensus system. So the framework is built to be fork resistant. What happens when a fork is attempted without majority consensus?
So this can get pretty technical. I'll try to keep it as high level as I can without going into too many details. But the basic idea that when we talk about, we should first talk about what is it when we talk about a hard fork versus a soft fork, because the term fork is really overloaded. There are several different meanings of the term. So, one of the meanings that you have is forking the code. So that means you just make a copy of the code and then you start to make some changes to the code. You have another meaning of fork, which is the idea that you take the existing ledger, the state of the ledger as it is, and then you have it start off on a whole nother path, right? Basically like a side chain, or starts following a different set of rules. So you have that idea of the ledger fork. Yet another version of the fork is the idea where you make a complete snapshot of it and you create a whole new coin that starts off from that point. And there's a couple other meanings too, but the primary thing when we talk about hard fork resistance and Decred, what we're referring to the idea of what, say, happened between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, and that's called a ledger fork. In other words, you start at some shared point in history at some block, and then you split off and you create an entire new coin. But everything before that point that you split, it stays, right? It's all exactly shared between the two different coins. So when we talk about hard forks or hard fork resistance, that specifically is what we're referring to. And so the way that Decred actually prevents this, or I shouldn't say prevents, it makes it extremely difficult and expensive to do, is that because the way that the hybrid system works, I mentioned a little bit before, but we have the tickets that have to vote on the blocks, or they have to be cast realistically. And each block is required to have at least 3. So 5 tickets get randomly picked each block, and at least 3 of those tickets have to be included in order to build on the previous block. So that actual requirement is the kind of the key, or the what makes it extremely difficult to have hard forks that the majority don't agree with. And the reason for this is that if we kind of go through the process a little bit of how a vote actually happens, I think it might make it a little more clear. So every node or every stakeholder that is voting is either doing it solo by themselves, or they're going through a voting service provider. But in any case, there's actually a fully validating node sitting behind that voting wallet. And that node has to validate all of those rules. So let's say that a new rule gets introduced that the majority don't agree with. Well, all of the nodes that they're running are going to reject those blocks. And because they're rejecting those blocks, the votes that the voters, the stakeholders that are relying on the full node to get to validate those blocks, they're not running that other rule set. And because they're not running that, they're not going to vote. And because they don't cast their votes, that other potential chain that's on the other rules really can't ever get going, because there's just no votes, and the consensus rules disallow it. And it gets pretty technical. We can go more into it if you want to about what happens if people change the consensus rules. And there's a lot of. I actually wrote a Reddit post quite some time ago, maybe a year ago, that goes in depth on this. But maybe like for a quicker recap, just to kind of get the ideas, like the primary way that it stops or makes it extremely difficult to happen is that you can think of the voters or the stakeholders that are voting simply aren't going to vote on the other rules. And because they're not voting on whatever those other rules are, the other chain dies.
So we spoke about the scenario before as well. So if there was a contentious vote, we would hope that the losing side sticks around. If they decided to fork the code and start a new chain, wouldn't that have the same social effect as the BTC forks? The community would be divided. The old DCR could be sold off, diluting the original project from the split members and so on. What are your thoughts?
Well, so I think there's probably at least some truth in that, in the sense that if there are a lot of large stakeholders, for example, that are not happy with the result of some vote, they could very well, choose to pick up all their eggs and go to another project, right? And if they decided to do that and they tried, say maybe they dump all their coins because they're upset, whatever the case is, so they dump all their coins, and it might actually have a hit on the exchange rate, for example, as all those coins are getting dumped onto the market. But I think that there are a couple of things that make a big difference. And number one is the fact that if you look at it in the case of if you have these hard forks or actual forks that share a history, you're really creating a whole bunch of inflation, right? Because everybody who already had coins on the original chain still has those same coins on the new chain, plus whatever all the new ones get created. And so you create this kind of situation where you have this extra inflation. And you really are, as a result, because of that, you're causing a lot of dilution. I know that in some ways people will say that, oh, well, that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, look at, like, say, the existing ones that's happened on. Some of them both have really high market caps. And that is true, but that can only be true for so long. It might happen twice. It might happen 3 times, 4 times. But eventually, right, that isn't going to be the case, right? The liquidity has to come from somewhere. And even if on the market cap side, or so to speak on paper, if it says that, well, hey, we forked off of the coin when it was worth 8,000, so now we're worth 8,000, that, as soon as you try to sell at that price, the price is going to crater way down. And so it's not going to be anywhere, that you basically, you can't get around the fact that you actually do need liquidity. And then I think the other big component of this is, I think that whenever people opt into the system, they kind of understand the fact that, look, you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. And that's really the only way that the system can realistically work. I mean, in any kind of this type of democratic process, I think that along the same lines, not directly related to cryptocurrencies, but, when we're talking about these kind of things, we're really more talking about, I would say, the social aspects as opposed to the technological aspects. And so, it's the same kind of issue in my mind as you have in society, in the sense of, like, well, the only way that you can actually have true freedom and everybody can agree to get along is that you need to be allowed to think and do whatever you want to do within, the rules or within the law, of course. It just the same way that the other person does too. Because if you don't have that mutual understanding that, hey, you know what, we're not going to agree on everything. You might want to change. I don't want to change. And this time around, hey, it went your way. You got the change. well, this next time around, maybe it'll go my way, right? And so then you're going to be upset because you didn't get it your way. So, I think when people buy into the system, when they understand that like that is the way that the whole system is structured, it's structured off this idea that stakeholders make decisions, and you win some and you lose some. I think that understanding that there has to be compromise, that alone actually doesn't really prevent per se, but I would say it hinders it. It makes it a lot less likely that it's going to happen. And as a case in point, I won't specifically say which ones because I don't want to sway any opinions, but there have already been more than one proposal that has passed, or there has already been more than one proposal that has passed that I didn't want. I'm still here, right? So, yeah.
So now we recently released 1.5. What can we expect? This is your turf. What can we expect? What are some of its features?
Right. So there's quite a few features. I think I'm going to mainly talk about the consensus rules that are changing, or the vote that potentially change the consensus rules, because it's what will probably be the most exciting. And I'll talk about a couple other things perhaps. But the primary thing that we're going to be voting on is a change to the block headers that allow what are known as header commitments. And so I'll explain that a little bit. The basic idea of a commitment is you basically it's a binding agreement or a binding piece of information in a way that says or maybe I'll just give an example. So if I have a file and then I take a hash of that file, or I send it to you and then you take a hash of the file, and then I send that same file to somebody else and then they take a hash of it. So you can compare those two hashes, and if they match, then you can be sure that the file was the exact same file. And so in essence, that hash is committing to the contents of the file. In other words, you're binding to whatever the contents of that file is. So whenever we talk about these header commitments, what we're really talking about is binding to a specific piece of information. And as part of that, the reason that this is actually important is because if you can bind to this information, you can prove that it's valid without actually having all of the information. In other words, you can create proofs that are very efficient and short that allows you to actually say that, for example, hey, these transactions are actually in the block. So there is already, several commitments in the header. For example, one of them is the Merkle tree and the stake root tree. And basically these are every transaction in a block goes through a process. I won't go into details, but it goes through a process and it pops out a single hash. And then that hash is put in the header. And so by doing that, that header commits to all of the transactions in the block. In other words, it says that, hey, these are in fact all the transactions that are in the block. So, however, the header is a fixed size, and changing the header size, it can be done, but because there's a lot of custom hardware out there, like ASICs, that actually mine all the time, typically speaking, we don't want to break a bunch of hardware. Software is easy to upgrade. But if you break hardware, it's a little bit of a harder pill to swallow. So, we're changing it in this in version 1.5 with this vote, so that it does it in such a way that we can actually extend that, and so we can have more of these commitments. And as a part of that, that's the primary kind of gist of the change. Also, as a part of that change, and so that we're not just committing anything, we're going to include an initial commitment to block filters. I'm sure we'll go over what those are a little bit more in depth later, but basically, in essence, the end result that they allow that's good for the user is that it allows lightweight clients to be able to prove that that this piece of information that they receive is actually reflective of the block that it says that it belongs to. And we can go more in depth on that if you want. But that's kind of the overall gist of the consensus changes. Very, very high level, very quick. Some other things that are in there. Another big thing I think is important for miners to know is that we've completely reworked the way that the mining subsystems work, so that remember, we've talked several times now about the fact that every block has these votes that it has to include. Well, these votes are coming from somewhere on the network other than the miner. So they take time to propagate across the network. And they're coming from all over the place because they're random. So, one may be coming from China, one may be coming from Australia, another one from the United States, from all over the globe, right? So these votes all go there. So currently, miners have to basically poll and say that, hey, I want to build this block. Do I have all the votes yet? And they have to keep polling and asking this question. And as a result, there's some extra delay in that process where they keep on polling. So we've changed the infrastructure over so that miners can choose to get notified whenever the votes actually arrive. So instead of having to poll and have these delays, they can find out the instant, like, hey, every vote's here. Now it's time to start mining on this block. And we did it in such a way too that the primary mechanism that the miners already use will wait until the votes get there, or it'll give them an opportunity at least for the votes to arrive. Doesn't wait indefinitely, but it gives it a chance for those votes to arrive before it ever hands out the first template. And the end result of that is that miners that haven't what we've seen on the network, I should describe why this is another reason why we did this, is that what we've observed on the network is that there are some pools out there that didn't really update the software very well for this particular aspect of Decred. A lot of them, took something from another proof of work only coin and then just modified it just enough to work with Decred. So what we see a lot of times is that certain mining pools that didn't upgrade their software properly end up creating these blocks that only have the minimum number of votes, despite the fact that stakeholders actually did cast those votes, but they took a little bit longer than the miner was willing to, or not willing, but then the miner decided to wait for. So not only do the stakeholders end up missing their vote, but the miner ends up getting a reduced subsidy, because every time, if they don't include the votes, they end up losing subsidy. That's another one of the rules that I didn't go over, but the incentive is they have a much higher incentive to include all those votes. So in essence, it makes it much easier for miners to use the system, and they don't have to worry about all the intricacies of this vote latency and propagation. And chances are that or maybe probably the thing that most people are going to care about is that your number of missed votes is probably going to go down with the new release. I think that's what most people probably care the most about.
Dave, why was a consensus vote needed in order to make these changes?
So if we talk about the block filters, well, number one is the fact that I kind of touched on it a little bit already, in the sense of allowing the multiple commitments to be made, is that we needed to change the header in a way that it didn't break the hardware. So by changing that header, but if you change that header, that is a hard fork. It's a non-backwards compatible change. And so that's why that part of it was needed. But the other big thing, not only does it allow a lot of future optimizations, and we can talk a little more about those if you like, but in terms of the 150 release, the reason that we wanted to be able to commit to these filters is that I think we probably should go over a little bit more what a block filter is. I don't think we talked about it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, you can cover it.
So the idea of a block filter is effectively, it is a way to determine if some piece of information that you're interested in is likely in a block without actually having the full contents of the block. So if we go by a way of analogy, we can think that you want to pack up a whole bunch of stuff in your house, and you take some stuff maybe from the kitchen, some stuff from the living room, from wherever. And so you put that stuff in a box, and you label it according to wherever it came from. For example, the kitchen or the living room. And then you send those off to your storage location that's way across town. Well, later on, you want something, and you're not sure if I can't remember if I packed that up in those boxes. So rather than driving all the way across town, opening up every box and going and looking for all this information, essentially what you do is you create an inventory of the contents in a lossy fashion, in the sense that, like, you have an inventory that says that this block contains stuff about the kitchen, right? This other block contains stuff about the living room, or a box, in the analogy. This box has stuff about the kitchen. This other box has stuff about the living room, whatever. And so that allows you to say, like, okay, now, so I know that this box has stuff in the kitchen, and then you can go a level deeper and say, okay, now what's in there? And so by asking what's in that box, then you know that if you have it, or very likely have it, first of all, so you can save the trip across town. And I'll tie this back into what was really going on behind the scenes in a minute. But so you save that trip of going across town, or, it's like, hey, yeah, I know that it's very likely in that box and I know which box it's in. So now I can go directly there, open the specific box that it's in, and pull out the actual item that I'm looking for. So in terms of that analogy, when we look at it on the real network, the boxes are the blocks, and the filter is kind of the inventory that lets you know that, hey, this block probably has what I'm looking for in it. And if it does, then you go and download the block. That's the equivalent of driving across town, right? Because it's somewhat expensive to download full blocks for light clients like mobile phones. So you can download that block, and then you can be pretty sure that the information that you're actually looking for is in there because you first check that filter. So that's kind of the high level basic principle of what a block filter does for you. Now, a potential problem with that, though, is that if you can't prove that, so you have to get these filters from somewhere. And these filters, of course, are obtained from the network, which are a bunch of untrusted nodes. You don't know who you're talking to out on the network. You could be talking to a malicious node or really anybody. So they give you a filter. So if you don't have a way to prove that that filter actually applies to the block that it says that it does, or that it claims to apply to, well, they can trick you and say like, hey, what you're looking for isn't in there. Or conversely, they can say, yep, it's in there. And then you go and waste time downloading the block on the mobile phone or the lightweight client. And it's not the end of the world by any means, but it's a denial of service. It eats up bandwidth. It takes a bunch of time. It's kind of annoying. But the other side of it, if you lie and say it's not in there, you can actually cause the balances to show up incorrectly because the wallet won't know about a transaction because it never got the block because it didn't think it had anything that applied to it in there. And so to stop all of that type of behavior, that type of denial of service behavior, what the header commitment does is it allows every node on the network to verify that a filter, and it creates this commitment that I was talking about before. Essentially, it hashes it, right? And so it sticks that into the header. And so by doing that now, all of these nodes can get a filter, hash it down, compare it to whatever the value is in the header and or the commitment, and they can prove then that, hey, yes, this filter actually does accurately reflect the contents of the block, because all of the fully valid nodes on the network would be rejecting this block if it didn't. And so that gives you a lot more confidence that it's correct, and you don't have to worry about those type of attack vectors that I just discussed.
So what can we expect in 1.6? Since you mentioned the future.
Yeah, I'm jumping ahead. Jumping ahead a little bit. So I think the biggest thing that I'm aiming to get into 1.6 is going to be the support for multi-sig Schnorr signatures. And I'm sure it's going to require a little bit of a explanation there of why and how all that plays out. But so currently right now, almost every transaction on the network uses a certain signature scheme known as ECDSA. And in a way, you can think of if I break down what a signature is and kind of how it works, is that whenever you say send me coins, or I give you an address, and so what that address really is it's a representation of a public key that also has a private component to it that only you have, or I have in this case, because I gave you the address. So you have this, in order to be able to spend the coins, you have to prove that you own them. So what happens is so this key pair gets generated, and then I give you the representation and an address, which is a representation of that, the public component of that key pair. Now, when you send the coins, then you're sending them to that public representation. Now, for me to spend it, though, now I have to prove that I am actually the owner of those coins. And I do that by proving that I know that private key associated with that address. And so, in essence, the thing is, though, is you don't want to actually reveal the private information, because if somebody else were to then send more coins to that same address, well, everybody out on the network would now be able to spend them because they would know what that associated private key is. So in order to get around that, the cryptographic primitive that's used is known as a signature. And in a way, it's sort of like a zero knowledge proof in the sense that it proves that you know what that private information is without actually revealing the private information. And so that's what a signature is. And the particular scheme or mechanism that we use currently predominantly is like I mentioned, ECDSA. It's not as efficient or easy to work with or as nice to work with as another algorithm that is known as Schnorr. It basically serves the same purpose. It creates the signatures, but it has a whole lot nicer properties in terms of aggregation, the ability to build more protocols on top of it that can do a lot of neat things, information hiding, collapsing of multiple different scripts, and kind of getting technical there. But it allows you to do a lot of neat things and tricks that ECDSA doesn't allow. Currently, we do support single signatures, but we don't have support for single Schnorr signatures, that is, but we don't have support for multiple Schnorr signatures. Another aspect that where this comes into play is that every time, whenever you're voting with a voting service provider, behind the scenes, what it is actually doing is it creates a multi-signature, currently using the other ECDSA signature scheme. But the reason for that is so that both the service provider has rights to vote and you retain the rights to vote. So you have multiple parties, right? So you create this multi-signature transaction. And so because of the fact we only support the ECDSA, then we have to use that. By partly, if you have multi-signature with Schnorr, though, we can switch over to use those. And as I hinted at earlier, I talked about aggregation, but the idea is that one of the really nice properties with Schnorr is that you can take as many signatures as you want and combine them all into a single signature that proves that everybody that was on there, or even a threshold, a certain number of them, are actually valid or not. So it's a much more compact form of way to do it. That will ultimately, make things faster, make the blocks have less data in them, and there are also a lot of other aspects to multi-signatures Schnorr that really get nice in terms of privacy. There's even some things that you can change. In fact, I think that Mateus has released some future information about that already, where you can make use of a lot of these things to create the ability to do ticket splitting over Lightning Network, for example. But they're really, and I won't go too much into the details there, but it opens the door for a significant number of optimizations and really neat scalability options that ECDSA doesn't allow. And in terms of, I guess the other factor is like, well, if they're so great, well, why aren't we already using them? Well, the primary reason is that Schnorr was actually under patent until relatively recently. So it's no longer under patent. And so you start to see, I think, even if you look in general in the cryptocurrency space, there's a pretty large number of projects that are looking to move in that direction. But that's why that it really they didn't get started there, was because, you basically had to have you had to pay to use the patent, and how do you do that with every single use in cryptocurrency? It's really messy when you have to deal with kind of patents. So that is probably the biggest thing in 1.6 that I'll share for now. There's going to be more optimizations and things along those lines, and perhaps some other surprises along the way.
Got it. So now, what are your thoughts on quantum computing, and what is Decred doing to protect itself from potential attacks?
So I would say that I think quantum computing is probably, at least in the level of what we're talking about here, it's probably farther off than a lot of folks would have you believe. That said, what it helps you with, there are certain problems that quantum computing actually helps you with, and other ones that it doesn't help you with. One of the big things that it breaks, and this will get pretty technical, but I'll try to describe it in somewhat easy to understand terms, is like it breaks what's known as the discrete logarithm problem, or the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, ECDLP for short. And so the mathematical trick that is used to do all of these things, like the signatures that I was just talking about, among some other things, the mathematical trick basically it revolves around the inability to break this problem, right, with classical computers. In fact, this isn't just in cryptocurrencies. This is the way that whenever you go to a website and you see that little lock that tells you that you're secure, that it actually used this exact same underlying fundamental primitive. But that is actually why there's a lot of concern about quantum computers, because with a quantum computer, you can break that. And if you can break that, then you can calculate or figure out what that private information that only you're supposed to have is from the public information. Now, but what they can't do, what quantum computers can't do, is they can't reverse a hash. So in Decred, all of your, remember when I mentioned earlier, I said when you send me coins, you're sending it to an address. Well, that address really is a representation of a hash of the public key. It's not the public key itself. It's a hash of it. So quantum computers don't actually help you there because they can't break the hash. So what that means is that for a quantum computer to actually do anything, there's a couple of fairly technical scenarios under which it applies. But one of them would be if it could, whenever you actually spend the coins, part of it is that you have to reveal that public key. Because remember, as I said before, you have that key pair, you have that private and public key, and the signature allows you to prove that you know the private information associated with that public key. But that also implies that you have the public key. Whereas when you sent the coins to an address, you really sent it to the hash of that public key. So you have to reveal the spender, when I'm spending the coins, I have to reveal that public key so that then you can prove that that public key hashes to the original hash that you sent the coins to. Now, what that means, though, is that if a quantum computer is going to be able to steal these coins, they have to break it in between the time you broadcast it to the network and the time that it gets into the memory pool of all the nodes, right? So it's a pretty short window. And so there's that. Then I think the more concerning part of it would be, though, that once you have ever used an address, and this is partly one of the big reasons why we are so big on not reusing addresses or working toward having no address reuse, and we certainly recommend to people to not reuse addresses, is because if you think about what I just said, when you spend coins for the first time, in other words, you've received coins to that address and you spend them, you have to reveal that public key. So that means that any future coins that get sent to that same address, the public key is now known because you've already revealed it. And so if you've revealed that, and a quantum computer then has all the time they want to be able to work on it. And so at that point, then they could potentially steal coins after the fact. Now, if you don't reuse addresses, the actual impact is fairly limited to that short window. Now, that said, I'm not saying that you don't have to worry about it at all, of course. But what I'm saying is that it's not as detrimental as it would be if we were only using, say, public keys and everything was revealed. So there is some protection there. Now, as far as what we're doing about it, we've actually looked at quite a few of the algorithms that are out there. And, the reality is that there just really isn't anything that is mature enough yet that has the level of review and rigor, mathematical rigor behind it to prove correctness that we feel it would actually be prudent to use. Because if there's a bug in any of this kind of crypto, this is where you really can, in many ways, bring down the whole system, right? If you deploy some cryptographic primitive that's not well vetted, and all of a sudden some vulnerability is found and people just start stealing coins left and right, that's very bad. So, we're definitely keeping an eye on it, and as soon as there becomes something that is a realistic, well vetted, and feasible approach, we'll go through the process of doing a consensus vote and getting it integrated. But like I said, I would say that it's something to worry about, but I wouldn't say that, it's something that you really, really need to be concerned about, because of the fact that there's a very small window. And also, the level of qubits that's needed to pull off this kind of attack that we're talking about is so far ahead of where they're currently at, well, publicly, that we know about anyway. Maybe, I don't know, some government actors might have a quantum computer of that level of capability, but like on the private market, we're several years out from that, I would say, at least.
Now, circling to BTC, if Bitcoin's cryptography was to break, what would be the likely cause, and what would happen to Satoshi's coins?
Well, so I think that, what we were just talking about with quantum computers, that's probably going to be the biggest or the most likely cause. At this point, the cryptography has been beat up pretty good. There might be, ultimately all schemes end up getting broken. So maybe somebody figures out a clever way to actually break the scheme. But I think probably the more likely cause is going to be just technological advancements that ultimately make it possible, whether it's quantum computing or some other type of technology. But it'll probably be a technological advancement. But in any case, I think that that when you look at like, okay, so well, what happens? So we start to look at, okay, what happens if it does get broken? Then what happens? Well, so really, the way I look at it is there's basically four different options that can happen in regard to the initial Satoshi coins over there. So, one, of course, is somehow the existing crypto never gets broken, therefore the coins never move, right? I think it's pretty unlikely because, we can look at, back at history. How many crypto schemes do you know of that can't be broken today, even from, say, 2 decades ago or 3, right? Like there really are none, right? So like ultimately they do get broken. Technology advances to the point that they can, either brute force or find certain tricks to cut down the number of attempts that it takes. And so it'll probably ultimately get broken. So now option number 2 then is that, well, so the existing crypto gets updated and the coins voluntarily get moved by the Satoshi entity to a new address or whatever proxy serves the same purpose as that underneath the new cryptographic scheme. And of course, that implies that Satoshi is still around and has the private keys, the ability to do that. The third option then is again the crypto gets updated but now the private keys are lost. Let's say the Satoshi entity maybe has either died or has lost the keys, whatever means, ultimately then. So what that implies then is that ultimately the coins are going to get stolen and reintroduced to the market over time by the thieves, probably after mixing them. Because, if the old cryptography is broken and those coins are still sitting underneath those old cryptography, well, they're going to get stolen, right? Eventually they're going to get moved. And the other option would be that because there was a break in crypto, the consensus rules are changed to make all those coins unspendable. But if that happens, it would break the immutability promise of the social contract of Bitcoin. So I really think that would be a pretty hard sell. But really, those are the only 4 options that can happen to the coins. In any case, except for the first one there, where we assume the crypto never gets broken, which is pretty unlikely over a large enough time scale. In all cases, the coins are going to have to move eventually and get reintroduced to the market or blacklisted, which involves, like I said, breaking the social contract.
Right. Dave, do you have any long-term concerns for DCR's future? Anything you see that's a potential threat?
Yeah, so I'd say probably maybe a lack of interest leading to failure to overcome the network effects. They undeniably have a large influence on the overall success or failure of projects. In terms of Decred, I think one of the huge strengths of Decred is the fact that it's often very forward-thinking, but it can also be a double-edged sword. As in my own observations, I've noticed that people tend to often be rather short-sighted and only focus on what's right in front of them. Like, for example, if there's a fire next door, it's pretty common to say, it doesn't affect me. Everything seems to be fine in my house, so I don't need to worry about it. Then that fire spreads to your house, and suddenly it's something you have to deal with. So, I think that tendency for short-sightedness could potentially hinder Decred's success if it leads to a lack of interest.
Now, with all the new advancements we have Lightning coming out, we have privacy 1.5, of course. What has you most excited, or what are you looking forward to next the most?
Well, so I would say for the future of Decred in general, the thing that really makes me most excited is really the governance and more specifically the adaptability that it enables. I know that over time, if everything keeps going well, and as we all hope and believe that it will, I fully expect at some point that some things are going to get implemented that I can't even think of today, right? There are going to be some new technologies that I don't, that none of us even imagine. Imagine kind of the idea of before, imagine a cell phone 100 years ago. Nobody could even think of that, right? So I expect that over time in the future, with that adaptability, we're going to see some pretty incredible enhancements and advancements, including things that we don't even think of or can't even imagine today. So overall, to me, really the most exciting thing is that obviously I'm a big tech head. I'm involved heavily in the tech, and I get excited about technology or new things in general. But just overall, from the Decred perspective, it's definitely the ability to adapt and overcome. And it's the prospective thing of the ability to implement all these new technologies as they come along. If there's a better way to do something, we can implement it. And just that cumulative effect that just grows over time, and it's like a snowball effect where you just get more and more changes. It just keeps getting better and better at a faster and faster rate. That really excites me.
Of course. Dave, I appreciate you coming on the show. What are your closing thoughts and message to potential stakeholders out there?
Well, I'd say that if you have any questions about the project, we actually have pretty good documentation. I invite everybody to dig in. If you have any questions that aren't clear from the documentation, you can come on to any of our social media platforms. For example, the Matrix chat for real time, or maybe Reddit or Twitter, whatever the case may be. But yeah, just check it out, ask questions, get involved.
Great. Appreciate you, Dave. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.